Today I'm going to talk about the effect of invasive species on the Woolsey Fire, monitoring native, post-fire native and non-native vegetation succession. And I want to first thank my collaborators on the project, Joey Curdy and Brad Schaefer, for which this project wouldn't have happened without them, and as well as my wonderful thesis advisor, Casey Terhorst. So let's do some background information first to talk about this project. This is Upper Las Virgenes in November 2018, just a few days after the Woolsey Fire. So this was one of the first places that was hit by the Woolsey Fire. Kind of looks like a desolate moonscape, seemingly desolate. So definitions, right? So what am I calling an invasive plant? Invasive plants, my definition is going to be a non-native plant with a negative ecological impact or effect as defined by the California-Invasive Plant Council. Okay, so that's the context in which I'm calling something invasive versus just non-native. And then what's a fire follower? So these are native herbaceous annuals or perennials that are going to respond positively when the seeds undergo fire. So there's also plants that resprout after fire. That's not these. So these are just like annual and perennial herbaceous kind of things, like herb kind of things. And then what's chaparral, where the building you're in? Chaparral is a Mediterranean shrubland in California, parts of the Southwest in Mexico. It's like, I describe it as it's like kind of hard to walk through. Some chaparral can be really tall, some can be soft and short, some can be like coastal sage scrub, but yeah, so chaparral, shrublands are kind of interchangeable in this discussion. So first, invasive plants and climate change. So invasive grasses in California have been expanding due to climate change. I'm going to show you this figure from a paper where vegetation monitoring in the 1930s found Los Angeles was primarily surrounded by shrubland and forest. By the 2013, a lot of that had become fragmented and replaced with invasive grasses. Here you can see the yellows, right? A lot of yellows. So this is disturbed habitat. Invasive grasses are expanding in range, right? And there's a myriad of reasons why that is, one of which is anthropogenic disturbance. So people digging up soil, creating new spaces for the seeds to grow, moving the seeds in their shoes and animal feed, building houses, right? Also changes in precipitation due to climate change and drought, more erratic drought and longer drought periods, as well as like erratic rain events, are favoring the range expansion of these invasive annual grasses. Also mustards, I think we can put it in that category too. And there's possible negative impacts on herbaceous fire followers, these annuals and perennials that respond positively to fire, as well as shrubling survival, shrubling being a baby shrub. So how are these being impacted by invasive grasses, right? So if I'm going to show you this picture from the Chaparral Institute, in the back here, we have shrubland, really green, verdant, woody, and it has kind of a normal fire return interval history, meaning there was fire there maybe every 30 to 150 years. That's pretty normal for this fire adapted system. Now, if we make a more frequent fire, then you have younger shrubs in there, you have some fire adapted native plants, maybe some invasive species in there. But that's fairly normal too. That's a little shorter on the time interval. But if we have a fire even sooner after that, just 2 years after, now you really shorten that fire return interval. So the things that can grow in that area are mostly going to be invasive grasses, right? And so this, it burns more frequently, and then we'll then burn this more frequently, and then this might probably impact this back community. And so we call this type conversion. There's a bunch of phase shift in more in different fields, but in California shrublands, we call it type conversion, turning this woody shrubland into this kind of herbaceous invasive dominated system. So just as that picture showed, shrublands are really patchy in their fire history and what plants are where. So as you see in this picture, you have boulders that you might have one species of plant growing here and a different over here. There's going to be differences in soil type from this hillside to this hillside. Different plant communities are going to prefer different aspects of the hill. So that's going to change what plants grow where and how fire acts in this system. So it's going to be really patchy, as well as how that's going to be seen in diversity and like species richness. You're going to have like one type of shrub in a small area, but then maybe just 10 feet away on a different hillside, totally different plant community. And if you look at all of that together, it's going to give you a totally different diversity metric, right? So again, there's different things going on in different scales in this landscape. So fire is really important in this system, especially because of how patchy things are. So it's important we know how are we going to measure fire in this system. And so one common way is by satellite imagery. So we look at the pre-fire, like before the fire happened, and they do these kind of flyover and satellite imagery stuff every year. And then we look at the post-fire. We get the normalized burn ratio from the satellite image. And then the difference of that gives us this thing called DNBR. Okay, and DNBR, the products that we can make from this DNBR, this fire index, is we can get burn severity, very roughly how hot the fire was, how severe it was. We can get that map, and then we can also figure out where the fire burned. So we get a bit of fire perimeter from that as well. So this is a low burn severity fire, just like really flashy fuels, which kind of goes through the system really fast. This is eucalyptus. If this is like a coniferous forest, these are good fires. These are clearing out the understory. Now, in California and shrubland, we more often than not have what are called crown fires. These are patchy to high severity fires that but it depends like what plant it's burning, right? If it's a shrub, it's going to burn very high severity, a lot of woody material. And then maybe just a few feet away, there's a grass, so it burns less severe. But this is what these plants are more or less adapted to, is this kind of patchwork of burn severity. So another way that we can measure burn severity is by measuring the twigs in the area after a fire, like we did in this project. So this is an example of a low burn severity. This is, again, a few days after the Woolsey Fire. There's the Woolsey Fire continuing over there in the corner. But this fire just quickly went through this area because there's small twigs, there's still scorched leaves. That's a low burn severity. So if I measured that with a caliper, give you a smaller number. Now, when the fire went through shrublands, like really thick, woody, the only thing that would be left is just trunks, like super thick trunks. So that would give you a bigger number that you would read on your caliper. And so that's evidence of a high burn severity. Let's kind of wrap this back to invasive species. Here we have a cartoon of some invasive annual grasses. They're dumping seeds into the seed bank after they die. Then they have a low burn severity fire. It happens frequently. And then the thing that comes up after the fire is more or less the same that was there before. But in addition, maybe there's a fire follower, maybe a native species that was hiding in the seed bank for decades and decades, waiting for a fire. Well, it's frequent, so it's probably just waiting a little bit. But it's coming up now, right? So what's happening between them, this non-native species and this native species? There's a competition. So what about composition when we have these fires? Is that going to dictate what comes up after the fire? So we have shrublands, right? They're depositing seeds, but there's also some probably fire followers in there, some mystery seeds that haven't been seen in decades. We have a big fire because it's woody material, right? High burn severity. We're going to get all these different types of fire followers that are coming up after the fire, and then maybe some baby shrubs too. But what's that species richness going to look like in these high burn severity areas? And then how's that going to relate to different aspects of fire? So the objectives of this study: measure average diameter of woody material, burn severity, and then look at the vegetation assemblages. Relate fire history of the transects, right? Not just the Woolsey Fire, but all the fires before that too, and the effects of non-native plants on burn severity. And then examine month-to-month succession and phenological differences for native and non-native plants post-wildfire. So phenological meaning how plants are changing over time. So here's our methods. Here's an example of one of our quadrats, a transect filled with lots of arroyo lupin and some nasty brassica nigra weed. So here's our study area. We did this in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. It's the largest national urban national recreation area in the United States. It's massive. It's kind of northwesty of Los Angeles. So here's Los Angeles down here. And this whole area in the Simi Hills. It's really big and beautiful. This is where the Woolsey Fire happened. It burned over 50% of the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. And it also burned 90% of the federal land. So the park itself is a mix of federal lands, state lands, private, nonprofit. There's a lot of people that live in here too. So this fire was really devastating. People lost their lives. A ton of buildings and homes were burnt and lost. You can see here this picture of these livestock were on the beach in Malibu waiting to be rescued. It was a really bad time for a lot of people. And so that made this research even more important when Brad got folks together at the national park. We all were like, how can we study this? People wanted answers. And so this project was kind of birthed from that. And so here are 16 of our study sites on this burn severity map. Here's Malibu down to the south, Thousand Oaks to the north, to show how urban this fire was, how many people were impacted by this. And this is a burn severity map, that DNBR that I talked about before, the satellite imagery. So green being unburnt or scorched, and then red being like very high burn severity. So you see a lot of the chaparral had that high burn severity in the middle up in Castro Crest and stuff. So how did we collect our data? So we collaborated with about 6 other universities and got 40 undergraduates. Most of them had no botanical background whatsoever. We had a training day. They learned how the methodology for the project. National Park helped us pick out the transects. We had about 30 transects initially. And they laid out these transects, right? These lines, 100-meter transects, 10 quadrats along them every 10 meters. And they measured things like species present, the species count data, like how many of each different species was there. And then also that burn severity metric with the calipers that I showed you, where they measured the thinnest twig at each, roughly near each one of the quadrats. Then we averaged that along the transect. And then the students would take, because most of them had no botany experience, so they'd tape their plants that they found in the quadrat, they'd pull it from outside the quadrat, and then they tape them to these cards and they give them these silly names like cute fish, tank grass, fennel. Well, it's not a fennel, it's an Eriophyllum convertifolium. And I looked at thousands of photos of plants, cell phone photos of their plots, of these like little herbarium cards. I just like months and months and months of looking at photos. It was a great time if you like plants. And I identified the vegetation and plots using, again, these photos and the student cards. I did a lot of my identifications using the e-flora from the Jepson manual. This is the most up-to-date version of the Jepson manual. They don't do prints anymore of the updated one. The second edition's now outdated. And I also used a local flora called the Santa Monica Mountains Wildflowers. It's an app and a website. If you don't have it, please download this app. If you go hiking around here, this is like the best guide to flowers around here. And so what did this give us, right? So we had pictures through time after this fire. We could map out how things were recovering after the fire. So here's kind of a demonstration of that. We only actually ended up analyzing 4 months of post-successional growth, but this just shows you how much things change even up to July. So 100-meter transect, 10 quadrats, and then month after month, the students would come back to the same place and take pictures. And here I'll show you just in 4 months how much things dramatically changed just in a single column. So this is February, you have fire followers, you have some baby plants, some are like growing faster than others. And then by March, you have lots of the fire followers getting bigger, you have some flowers, the weeds are starting to come up too. By April, the caterpillars began eating a ton of the flowers. They were painted ladies, a huge migration, it was really beautiful. And they were eating a lot of the lupins and the phacelias. The non-native plants are already going to fruit. And then some of the native plants, the fire followers, are persisting, right? Most of them have died back by now. Most of the non-natives have definitely died back by now. And now we're starting to see more shrubs. More shrubs are coming up and establishing and being competitive. So what analysis did I do for this huge amount of data? For 27 of the sites, I examined burn severity comparing the USGS satellite imagery to twig thickness. So that metric I used that we used measuring with the calipers. Then we did a Pearson correlation for that. And then for 16 of the sites, for that first month of the growing season in February, so that's 3 months after the fire, we looked at the natives and non-natives in that area and then compared that to our metric for burn severity as well as fire history. And for those, we did ANOVAs with type 3 sums of squares. And then for 10 of the sites that I had good enough phenological data for, this was after a lot of data cleaning, we wanted to see what happens from February to May and how that changed phenologically month after month. And for that, we did mixed linear models with transect as a random effect and then permanovas for those. And then we displayed the community data with NMDS plots for visualization. So what are my results? So here's some of the effects of the Woolsey Fire. So Here on the x-axis, you're going to have burn severity. So that's the twig measurement. And then on the y-axis, you're going to have the ratio of non-natives to native plant abundance. So each one of the plants counted out and then categorized by native and non-native. And then on the scale, the colors is going to be the proportion of invasives in the plot, right, as a total of the total abundance. So it's going to go from yellow to dark purple. So dark purple being like no invasives in that plot. And you see that places that had more invasive species, like this yellowing invasive grass, they had lower burn severity. Those were flashy fires. And we found that places that had less invasives had higher burn severity. And then we also found that same trend for the abundance of invasives, so not just the proportion, but also the abundance, that we had a higher abundance of invasives in plots that are lower burn severity and a lower abundance of invasives in places that higher burn severity. So let's look at the Woolsey Fire and historical fires. So all those fires kind of combined. Places that had a short fire return interval, so that's the time since the last fire, they had the higher abundance of invasive species. And then places where there was a longer fire return interval, like they hadn't seen a fire between the healthy range, 30 to 150 years, they had a less abundance of invasive species. This is where things get a little tricky and counterintuitive in my own head. I measured fire return interval in 3 different ways, one of which was the time since the last fire. Another way was this average interval between recorded fires of all their fires. And I also looked at the number of fires. But this average interval of fires, we actually found higher species richness when it was shorter, and then lower species richness when it was longer, this is the more quote unquote normal, right, fire return interval for chaparral and shrublands and stuff. So these sites that burned really often had higher species richness. And there's no kind of like pattern with the invasives, the proportion of invasives in the site. It's just kind of all over the place. It's like polka dotted. So again, would love to talk more about this. Don't know what's going on, but I think it's a super interesting result. And then decreased species richness was at places that burned fewer times. So this was another way I quantified fire history, was looking at the number of burns since 1933. And lower species richness, and this is the first month in February, right? So this is 3 months after the fire. I don't know what species richness was like in like July for a lot of these sites, but just in February, it was lower. So this might've been just like one fire follower. So super interesting. Kind of like this site only burned a few times, but look at it, it's just dominated by Calicortis. It was a super pretty site, but there's only a few species here, and this site didn't burn that often. So what about successional patterns, like phenological changes month after month? So here we have month on the x-axis, and then the abundance of native plants. So all the different fire followers, shrubs, everything put into this category of natives. And it did have a significant relationship to month. So there were changes month after month in the abundance of natives. I didn't find the same pattern for shrubs or fire followers, but I did find it for the entire category, which it was just marginally significant. For invasives, though, we definitely found a stronger pattern where they went down. So by May, so that's February, March, April, May. By May, most of the invasives had died and they had set seeds in the soil. And we also found that when you boiled that invasive category down to just invasive grasses, they significantly went down by May, and they were mostly dead and had put their seeds into the seed bank. So what about community patterns when we look at everything, right? So this is an NMDS plot. So things that are closer in the center are more similar to each other. And then we have the species abundances plotted as well as the time of sampling. So 1 is February, 2 is March, 3 is April, and 4 is May. And we found both a significant pattern of site. So each one of these circles was a different site, and month, and a relationship between site and month. So different, their species abundances are different depending on certain sites and certain months, which to me just is like these places are really patchy, and there's different things happening in different months and different species at different months. So that's really interesting. Groups of plants are different depending on the site and month. So for this, what we did was we took all 70 or so of the species we had at these 10 different sites, and we boiled them down to 6 categories. And that's woody, shrubs and trees and sub-shrubs, invasive grasses, California-Invasive Plant Council ranked invasives, non-natives, natives, and fire followers. And all these plots are kind of like stacked on top of each other, so it's a little confusing to interpret, but the months are in different places, so it stretches things out a lot. And they are kind of grouping. So woody shrubs and trees, only a few of the plots had those, and then a few of the plots had grasses and invasives and stuff like that, and those were separated from where plots that had more natives and fire followers. And there was a significant influence of when we were sampling for these different categories and where they were. So there's differences in time and space. Discussion. Oh, I do want to say about this. That photo I showed you in the beginning of the moonscape, this is around that area just 2 years before. So this is Upper Las Virgenes, this is near Chatsworth, right? This like in West Hills and stuff. This is just flashy fuels. Just like all of this was gone in just a matter of like a few hours. It was really, I was actually there the day the fire happened. I was on Amundsen Ranch, which is like way over there. But it was really dramatic, yeah, and very quick. So let's talk about what we found for February. So again, invasive annuals or invasive abundance was associated with lower burn severity, flashy fuels. And they were also associated with a higher burn severity as well. And these sites that burned more frequently, they had higher species richness, right? So what's going on with that? That's kind of funky. So let's go back to the cartoon drawings. So we had the dead grasses, right? See, they have little faces that show they're dead. They are depositing seeds into the seed bank, frequent low burn severity fires. And then what was there before is probably going to be there after with the addition of, fire follower. But is there competition? A few months later, they're dropping seeds in the seed bank, and the native plants were often still alive. So they're probably getting optimal space in the soil bank, right? Because if the natives die after them, they deposit the seeds on top of them, they're more at risk of predation, but I guess it's herbivory, whatever. Like something's going to eat their seeds. I guess I'm in the room full of zoologists. Anywho, so their seeds are more at risk. So there could be competition going on in the seed bank. I'd love to keep looking at this, but obviously not within the scope of this study. And there seems to be more species richness at these frequently burning sites with low burn severity. So it actually kind of more looked like this. It was less like just the grass and one fire follower. There was like more species going on there. But that's not to say in the Santa Monica Mountains, there's definitely, in the Simi Hills, there's definitely not type converted sites that have totally changed because of disturbance, because of frequent fires. So you'll go to them and it's like all mustard, and then it burns frequently, and then it's all mustard again. So that definitely happens. I'm not saying we just didn't find that as often in our plots. So February to May analysis, invasive dump a lot of seeds in the soil quickly after the fire. Native plants, including fire followers, persist longer than the invasives. So they're kind of chugging along still. And shrubs are generally way more apparent in May. And that's generally when they're more competitive and when they can kind of stay out on their own. Shrublands have a really high mortality rate too after a fire. And then these sites are heterogeneous in time and space in species abundances and functional groups. So they are changing depending on when you go out there. There's definitely things going on. And then so for these more intact native shrublands, right, that have more shrubs, they're dropping seeds in the seed bank with all the fire follower seeds too. What's happening with species richness in this high burn severity? Well, they're patchy. There's not as much species richness on a single transect as you would think. And there's like a big patch of this fire follower, and then over there, a big patch of this other fire follower. Then they'll disappear in the seed bank for a few decades. And then you'll see the same pattern again once another wildfire happens. So they have lower species richness, and then the shrubs, they take a little longer to like be a little more competitive. So then the shrubs will pop up, maybe even once these fire followers start dying away. So what are the implications of this kind of work? This is further justification for invasive species removal as they increase fire frequency and decrease fire severity. They're changing things, right? Even if it's less severe fires, which sounds better, they are changing things to kind of unnatural regimes that the native plants are used to. And then invasives should be managed in already disturbed sites. So sites where there might have been previous agriculture or there's like a development close by. And you should treat those invasives in the first few months after a fire in that growing season. And that's important before they set seeds, because they set seeds by like March, April. If you try to treat them by then, it might be too late. And then fire followers are persistent even in these frequently burned sites. So the sites that are seemingly really disturbed, that's because they're fire adapted. And so potentially they could be incorporated into restoration plans. But I want to add the caveat that you should probably focus on perennial shrubs first, as research from like UCI has shown that you should focus on the shrubs, because these invasive, even these native fire followers can be competitive to perennial shrubs. So future directions. I am already working on this, and I've already talked with my advisor and Brad about this, but I'm also looking at iNaturalist data after a wildfire. So iNaturalist is this app that helps you identify plants and animals. You should all download it. It's really cool. But it also gives the data to scientists that can use it for projects and stuff. So it kind of bridges that gap between the public and academia in a really cool way. So what associations can we, of observations between community science, right, things that the public generates, and plants, and the relationship to burn severity, what can we detect? And so I already have some results, but don't want to share that today. I'm also really interested in working with undergraduate researchers. So something I didn't talk about yet for this project is Brad was able to, and some other funders were able to get money together to be able to give gas cards to the students, to the undergrad students, and also to give them gift cards in order to fund, you know, buy food and stuff like that. And I think it's really important to get the lower the bar to get undergrads out in the field, right? And so I find this super fascinating, and I want to continue this kind of work. So how can we make field work more accessible for majors? And here's the important one, for non-majors, people that are going into like biomedical sciences and stuff like that. I think that's really important that we get those folks, they feel welcome in the field and it's accessible for them. The other thing is, does botanical fieldwork lessen student plant awareness disparity? This might be a new term for some of you. So plant awareness disparity is this modern issue in which people don't recognize plants. They just see them as a green mass of stuff. They don't know that the medicine they can get out of plants. They don't know the food they can get out of plants. They don't know the plants that they're living with. We just aren't aware of them. And so I'm wondering, does this kind of work make students more aware of the plants that they're around, about the risk of fire in their community? So love to keep looking at that. And then also invasive plant, annual grasses and native plant competition. There has been a lot of research in this, but I'd like to do some greenhouse experiments, especially of how are invasive grasses decreasing survival in shrublands and native forbs, right? Like just in like paired competition experiments with things that need fire in order to grow, things that don't need fire, things that just grow by gravity, like dispersing their seeds by gravity, things that disperse their seeds by wind. How are invasive annual grasses competing with these plants? And then as well as, is a medium fire return interval of 10 to 30 years, which is probably going to happen under, if it's not already happening in most places, under a climate change regime, is that going to cause extirpation of these things called obligate cedars? Obligate cedars are shrubs that more or less are fire adapted, and they grow better if they're burned. So if the seeds burn, you're going to get way more germination than if they don't burn. How is a shorter time interval between fires going to impact them? Because if they don't have enough time to dump seeds into the soil bank, what's that going to do for the babies, right? So if you're like a baby and you're growing, and all of a sudden a fire comes through before you put seeds in the seed bank, you're gone, extirpated. So I'm interested in this kind of fire return interval. If plants can take, if 10 years is enough time to get them growing in order to put seeds in the seed bank. What's my future? So I'm going into the Coughlin lab at Boise State University. I'll be studying sagebrush steppe. This is one of my favorite plants, sagebrush, and this really fascinating grass called Bromus tectorum, which some of you might be cringing. It's a really bad invasive grass in the Great Basin, but I'm super excited. I have a lot of people I'd like to thank. I'm not going to do it right now, but especially funders, the California Garden Club, the California Native Plant Society, and the San Fernando Valley Audubon. I'd also like to thank people that supported this project, like the UCLA Lacrette Center, the National Park Service, and the CSUN Biology Department. I'd like to thank my family for their support. I'd like to thank my partner, who also drew a lot of the drawings for this, Gabriel Valbuena. Alyssa Fries was my partner on this project, like on the ground, and she significantly helped. And then my amazing lab mates, Gloria, Lexi, and Kristen, and then of course, Casey Terhorst, my advisor. I'd also like to thank Aida Metzenberg and Stan Metzenberg. They passed away, but I don't think I'd be here if it weren't for their support too. And wanted to make sure I talked about them. And I'll take your questions now.